Hello, everybody. Today, I am really pleased to talk with three women, Latina leaders from three very consequential big NGOs. We are talking today with Julia Sanchez of ActionAid International, with Sofia Sprechban of CARE International, and with Gabriela Bucher of Oxfam International. And I have to apologize up front. I just realized I forgot to double check the pronunciation of your name. So please correct me now if that's necessary. Did I do okay, or should I say it differently?
They're flexible pronunciations.
Good. Well, let me then start by before we go into the substance of this recording and the episode. So I want to tell my audience briefly about first Julia of ActionAid. She is the Secretary General of ActionAid International. She was a senior researcher at the Canadian Union of Public Employees and also was a candidate for a political party in Canada. And I just want to highlight that because I think that's so interesting and wonderful, Julia, that you have had this mix of careers, not just in the NGO and civil society sector, but also in other adjacent sectors. I think that brings real strength to any profile. And Julia was also the president CEO of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. Sofia is the Secretary General of CARE International. She has fulfilled many other roles in CARE, amongst others, the Program Director, Deputy Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean. And interestingly enough, I saw, Sofia, you were also a researcher on public opinion and media surveys in the past. And again, an interesting mix of identities there, professional identities. And then Gabriela, the Executive Director of Oxfam International, formerly Chief Operating Officer at Plan International. And you were also President of Plan Colombia, is that right? And you have also fulfilled a number of other jobs, as all of you have, but this is a short profile. So welcome, everybody. I am going to let me just explain why I wanted this recording. It's not every day that some of the most consequential large INGOs are headed by Latina women. It's not every day that they're headed by women at all. Um, and it's a cause for celebration in my mind. This doesn't mean, just saying this to my audience, that we're only going to talk about women in leadership, although that will be one of the topics. We will also talk about your approaches to leadership in general and your leadership behaviors, and especially during this last 1.5 year of the pandemic. So let's go. So let me start with Sofia. Sofia, how has CARE International fared in the last 1.5 years of COVID? And what in particular have you learned about change management in that phase?
Thank you, Tosca, and hi, Gabriela and Julia. Really wonderful to be here with all of you. Well, there's, I think, so much we have learned, and this year it's really hard to list, but because a lot has happened in this year, not just COVID, but also the call to decolonize aid and dismantling white supremacy from our sector. So it's really hard to disentangle. It really comes all together. But I think one really important aspect is the fact that we have been able to kind of maintain programs and humanitarian response even under these extreme constraints and without international travel, which is of course much more carbon friendly. And I think that has also meant that has been much more delegation of authority, and not only delegation of responsibility also to local actors, both in the countries in which we seek impact. So I think actually, strangely, and that's why I want to mention both COVID and the call to decolonize aid, because in a weird way, the pandemic has supported this, because more space has been created by the inability of international travel. And I think that has helped, like the new normal has helped to change the mindset, which is long overdue, but in a weird way, it has helped. Of course, we have learned many more things in terms of our ability to, work from afar, integrate teams in a different way and with different methodologies. But anyway, I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that.
Yes, I'm sure we will. And such good points how you said basically this the crisis around COVID and the self-critical reflection and action, hopefully, that we are going through on I can never pronounce this word, decolonizing aid, is also an opportunity. And it sounds like you feel that CARE has seized that. Let me turn to you, Julia. What have you learned about, especially in the first let's say 6 months of the pandemic, what have you learned about crisis leadership? Or maybe you had learned things about crisis leadership in the past that you had to apply and some additional learnings happened.
Thank you. And thanks for this invite and the opportunity to speak to all of you. To build on perhaps what Sofia was saying, I think, one of the things I've learned is this amazing ability for teams to continue working, despite, as I often say to my colleagues, we're responding to the biggest humanitarian crisis we've ever had to respond to. Biggest in the sense that it involves everybody, right? Everybody is hit by the crisis while we're trying to respond, which has never been the case before. And we're doing this with at least one hand tied behind our backs, if not both hands. And yet we're doing it, right? So remarkable mobilization from our teams, our partners. However, I have to say, so that was what I felt in the first 6 months for sure. And now, 14, 15 months in, I'm feeling like we're hitting a wall. I'm very concerned about our staff, our teams, despite all the efforts to hold it together, to keep moving forward, the very important generosity of our donors. And I suspect this has been true across the board. I mean, we expected a major hit because of COVID for all the obvious reasons. And it hasn't been anywhere near as bad as we anticipated. So we've actually had, generous support from our donors. So it's allowed us to keep doing interesting work, responding to the crisis. But I do feel that, like I think all of us in our personal lives, where that light at the tunnel is so dim and still so far, I feel like the teams are starting to reach their breaking point in a way, and I am very concerned about that. So we can talk more about how women leading, feminist leadership, self-care, how we have to really up our game on that front. But I am currently concerned. If I can add one more thing about what I might have learned in the beginning. I think, so we are a global secretariat of about 180 staff working out of 27 countries. And we have 3 hubs, London, Johannesburg, Nairobi, but I suspect, and I was new, I came together with COVID to the organization, but I suspect that we didn't know how to work as the global team that we were. So we still worked as a team that was mostly based in Johannesburg, Nairobi, and London, and not acknowledging and embracing the fact that a lot of our colleagues were completely outside those hubs, right? And so the fact that we were forced to be grounded and forced to work online has allowed us to work as a really global team where it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in a hub, you're still working at home, whether you're in, the only person in one country like me, you're still working at home. So everybody's on the same kind of footing. So it's helped, I think, with the team, kind of everybody being on the same level of, inability to be there in person, but access to tools and just working online. So I think that's really interesting. And I hope we keep some of that. I'm not sure we will by default. I think we're going to have to be very intentional about holding on to some of those, lessons learned about ways of working, because we might just revert back to, flying all over the place. And
well, guess what? I was going to ask you a question about that later. So hold on to that thought. So really interesting, Julia, around what you said around both resilience and inventiveness, as well as that there are limits to that from a human perspective, but also how a team that was de facto hybrids, that was partially co-located and partially distributed, is now actually maybe gelling better and equalizing more in terms of how they respond and interact with each other. Gabriela, do you want to jump in on either what you learned about change management or about crisis leadership?
So again, thanks. I'm really happy to be in this conversation with you and Sofia, Julia, that we speak with regularly. One thing that brings us together is also having stepped into these roles in the middle of COVID. So that's actually been, and something you may want to explore how it has been. So I left the Plan International office in March. That was the last office I left. So I joined Oxfam, and it's all been virtual. One thing that really strikes me in terms of and echoing what Sofia first was saying is, I think the boundaries of what we thought was possible in terms of change have moved significantly. So I think we've all realized we can actually collectively as humanity make some decisions about behaviors and major elements that need to change, system changes. So I feel that many of the things that Oxfam was talking about for a long time in the past, inequality and how it's multidimensional and it affects obviously women more, and how it affects people from different ethnic and racial backgrounds. But I think it's been so clear. So the Secretary General called it an X-ray. So the pandemic has been an X-ray. So we've all been able to see this X-ray. So we are now able to act because we have a better understanding of what has been wrong with the system. So the issue that, health, we know it theoretically, but now we felt it in our families, friends, countries, how important access to healthcare and equitable access to healthcare, and how something like vaccine access creates such inequality. And that's something I'm pleased and happy that Oxfam was able to quickly pivot into that issue of vaccine, the people's vaccine, as a key inequality issue now. So it's how to understand the moment and then think what might shift the conversation and what needs to be done now as a result of this new situation. But as Julia says, there's also this amazing opportunity to work. So we have ubiquitous. I also have difficulty with that word. We can be ubiquitous. So instead of feeling separated and by not being with teams physically, I think we have this incredible opportunity to be in very close contact with people in our teams across the world. So there's opportunity, but yes, also challenges, as Julia is saying. I'm sure we can discuss on that.
Yeah, I would like that. Maybe before, let's build on what Julia brought up earlier about old habits. So my question, and let me see, why don't I go back to you, Julia, since you brought it up first, and then Sofia, Gabriela, jump in as you want. So what old habits should we not fall back into after the pandemic, and how will you, as an individual leader, try to minimize that risk?
So the obvious, perhaps, and the top of mind one for me is travel, right? We have, as a sector, depended so much on travel. And as Sofia was pointing out at the beginning, I mean, the fact that we can't travel has kind of pushed us forward on this localization, decentralizing, putting decision-making closer to where things happen, which we're all committed to in principle, but this has been like a push in the back to say, okay, now you have to do it. Not that you want to do it, you have no choice. So that's been a positive, I think, development. And we've realized, oh, we can actually do this. It reminds me of a time when I was working in Nepal during the conflict, the armed conflict, and we were given funding to work in what became, between the proposal writing and the funding actually coming through, became one of the hardest hit conflict areas. It wasn't what we had designed to do, to go in there in such conflict situation. But then we had to learn to work through our partners and to monitor and evaluate the program without ever setting foot in the communities, which seemed like an impossible thing to do. But we were so committed to working with those communities that we figured out a way to do it, right? So it's that necessity is the, what is it? The mother of invention or something. So I think we're in that moment. So I think the tendency to go back to saying, oh, we need to travel, we need to go everywhere, we need to, be on planes all the time, we need to meet in person. Of course we do. There's definitely, I'm desperately waiting for the day when I can meet in the same room for a couple of days with my senior leadership team. I've never met most of them. We've never been in the same room since I joined, it's been 14 months. So of course, some of that is necessary, but where do we draw a different balance, right? I'm hoping that we can do much less travel and really be much more strategic about when we need to mobilize, even for governance purposes, right? We have a general assembly of our members once a year, which is a big, 1-week event. Everybody comes from all over the world, huge mobilization expense. Can we do that every other year and then have a virtual AGM on the alternate year, which we've just done? We're going to do again this year. And it was really efficient. It's different. We lose some stuff, but it works at a different level, right? So how do we find that new balance? And really, of course, because not only for localization and the good impact, but for the carbon footprint, right? Which is, it's something that we really need to live up to, and we have that opportunity now.
Yes. Sofia, Gabriela, do you want to mention one more thing before I want to ask you something also about employee experiences after the pandemic?
I might mention, what has been interesting. It has also, in a strange way, democratized. I think our dialogues, like everyone is the same kind of rectangle on screen. There's no one sitting, I don't know, on one end of the table that maybe. And I think that in a weird way, what I have found quite interesting this year, we've never been more far apart and not seen each other face to face. At the same time, I know more about my colleagues now than I have ever known, because their children come in, their dogs and cats come in. We see in the background, the poster, the art anyone may have. There's something really personal about being in each other's spaces that, when we were kind of in office spaces only, or, after the office, maybe going out for dinner together, but there was not that sense of really, I know now the names of most, sons and daughters and children of my colleagues, which I didn't know before because I had not seen them. and there is something just, that is very special about this moment. Now, I do think that it's harder to read a room on Zoom. It's harder to sense the energy. There's something that I'm missing hugely, which is about being in the same room with flip chart and markers in hand, because we can marinate things in a different way. And I do feel that we should never go back to what it used to be. But there's what we can craft together seems to be taken also longer on Zoom. What we may be accomplishing with everyone's energy in the room over 1 hour in the same room may take 3 hours on Zoom. So despite all the maybe fancy whiteboard, kind of apps we may be using. So nothing can replace human kind of energy in a room and reading a room and connecting. At the same time, we were doing way too much of it. And of course, these are all resources that impact the planet if we fly too much, but also impact our lives. And these are resources that can be put to a much, much better use to fight poverty and inequality.
Exactly. Let me then maybe pivot to Gabriela by marrying. Gabriela, you made a really good point to me, saying, should we not also talk about the fact that all three of you have basically virtually onboarded, right, with your organizations? Now, of course, in Sofia's case, she had been in care for a longer time, but Gabriela, can I ask you, not just on virtual onboarding, but if you think about how Oxfam is designing the employee experience, what it will be like to be an employee at Oxfam after the pandemic and also after decolonizing aid, what comes to your mind? Not at a very granular HR level, but more at a strategic HR level. What comes to your mind?
So what I was thinking about, just as Julia and Sofia were talking, is the other side, the threshold for having something face-to-face. I've always said nothing replaces being in touch directly with our partners and experiencing communities and where we are doing the work. But even that, I think, is always distorted, and I've always reflected on that. If I go and the more I have these titles associated to my name, the more distorted the reality that I see is. So I think there's opportunity for us to do it very differently. So I've done virtual country visits, and it's actually very playful to say we're imagining a situation by which this is all, even being taken through the streets of a city that I've never been to. But also, I think going forward, the possibility of having interactions with people through those closest to them. So our partners and people who are from those same cultures, and using media like virtual recordings of those conversations, or even having it live with us, asking questions or interacting through them. So I think, yes, it's definitely a different experience of being that person who is on the ground, so to say. But we're also rethinking how we refer to all those. I've always been a bit, I always this word, the field. Why are things called the field? When I grew up in what would be called the field, but I mean, for me, it's a city like everybody else, and why is local in Colombia, and there's a lot of local in the UK, but suddenly when it's in an NGO, it's not considered that way. So there's a sort of distortion of the world. So I think, going back to what Sofia, this democratization combined with how the Black Lives Matters movement and has really been a catalyst for rethinking these colonial roots of the organizations that we represent, and really using different language, using different ways of relating to each other that are much less hierarchical and that are more networked. But within it, I think we're still creating what those rules of engagement are, how we are flexible and attuned to the expressions of different cultures, different perspectives, different individuals, but there's also some common that brings us together. So how do we have both, so the global and the local, and together creating an interesting different balances as we go along. So I think it's how we use our technological tools to be very mindful of that interaction in new ways.
I like that what you're saying is how to create a different balance between global and local. So let me pivot us now to the topic of women in leadership. I'm just gonna quote a few kind of fairly recent research findings around women in leadership in the private sector. So long-term studies of how women and men leaders are rated in 360 assessments in the private sector have shown that women are rated statistically higher on about 85% of relevant leadership competencies than men do, including when they're rated by their male managers. Women are also rated as being more open to change, while at the same time being more cautious about risk taking. We've seen some research data, again, in the private sector, but still that women, when organizations have more women in senior positions, these companies are more profitable. At the same time, they're more socially responsible, and they provide safer, higher quality customer experiences, which translates, I feel, directly to experiences of participants in the programs that NGOs run. But we also know from, let's say, the 2020 edition of the Fair Share Monitor that only 13 out of the 30 international organizations have a fair share of women leaders, that a man is 3 times as likely to rise in leadership in our social sector than women do, etc., etc. So without wanting to be essentialist about women's leadership characteristics or overly generalizing, because there are clear risks in those departments, to what extent do you think it matters that your organization is headed by a woman from a leadership behavior perspective? So maybe, Gabriela, this time let me turn to you first.
Yes, it's complex because also we need to move away, and we are in our thinking and our experience, our behavior is also moving away from the binary. So we're not just, and today is actually a day when we are in fact celebrating the inclusion of non-binary, transsexual, all the different gender identities that we celebrate. And also within our own identities, we have so many different ones. So here we are as Latina women, but we're also so many other things. So yes, I suppose, and from the research you're saying there's certain elements in common, which are interesting, which can also be found in men who are somehow more in tune or aware. I think somehow the experience of a woman in general, again, sort of generalizing, takes us more to questioning certain things because we're less the expected. So I think we shared in a previous conversation with Julia and Sofia. I remember when I became country director for the first time, I think many people said, really, like they had not been a woman and not one that young. So for them, those two characteristics of being younger and a woman, that didn't equate to the leader that people were expecting. And suddenly you're the unexpected. And then that means you're also looking at yourself in those eyes of the unexpected. And I think that is part of what happens. I think as the experience of a woman, you are, or I am, looking at myself as well as being, because I have all these questions coming. So that makes me, I think, reflect deeper on certain issues that if there wasn't that questioning, maybe I just would take certain things for granted. So that may be part of the reason. So I question that position that I achieved and that people are seeing with those eyes. What does it mean? How do I exercise it? How do I exercise it as myself? How do I, how am I authentic here? And where are my models of leadership, or where am I developing that?
Interesting. Sofia, what do you think? Does it matter or does it not matter?
It's a really good question. And like Gabriela, I also wouldn't take it in a binary way, but, you know, at the risk of doing so and maybe being a bit schematic, but maybe just to portray it, I think, I mean, leadership has been defined by men for thousands of years. And so when we contribute maybe our style, it may be seen as irrelevant or inappropriate, you know, and I have felt that when I have shown vulnerability or humility or, you know, and maybe in some moments of my leadership journey, I think my feelings, my doubts, my hesitations, my tears, even in meetings, you know, may have seen as kind of, oh, she's not up to the challenge, you know, when I actually believe that that's precisely those doubts, being able to be open about what we're feeling, show our deepest humanity. And of course, I don't think there's any woman in the world who sometimes has not suppressed it, because then we might not be seen as capable. So, you know, I think then what matters in terms of your actual question is that when we, women that may have reflected about this, and when we are in leadership positions, we may give more room to that, you know, to colleagues we work with, to our own teams, to the style we set in the organization. And this is not easy because we're kind of always walking this tightrope of, you know, playing the expected leadership role by others, you know, in a man's world that has been traditionally that. And but in turn, wanting to change the role of a leader. So, and give that space to women and diverse people to intervene. So I think it is really difficult to balance that and find this balance between these very different systems, because you want to be respected as a leader, and at the same time, you want to open that space. So, you know, the system of patriarchy and white supremacy is also a system that, you know, requires, like, you know, speed, perfection, perfect English, logic, evidence, and even more so in organizations that actually one of our fundamental roles is humanitarian response, and those have been kind of the privileged qualities. So, So it's really hard because we want to open the way, demonstrate a different type of leadership, where we want to put other qualities into play, yet the expectation is often based on kind of that, more traditional mindset. So I actually yesterday also found just yesterday was on Twitter, a fabulous quote by Jacinta Ardern from New Zealand, which I tweeted yesterday. And it was, I'm a big fan of her, of who is not these days, but, that she said something like leadership is not about being the loudest in the room, but instead of being the bridge or see what may be missing in the discussion and trying to build consensus from there. And that's often, I think, the roles we may want to play in our organizations. And that's often what we have been brought into the organizations, yet the expectation is often still sometimes by, the powers around us, intra-organizationally and externally, that, we are the perfect speaker in this panel with just the wisest comments and the loudest voice. And and maybe if I may bring in a final point, I mean, the burden of care that has fallen on women in general, is another one I cannot leave out of this conversation, because, in my case, I raised my son on my own for most of his childhood. And, it meant that, and by the time my son was 24 months old, I had traveled to 24 countries with him. And so one a month, and that made 16-hour shifts, because it was, the work, the travel, the taking care of him at night, and often this leads us to a feeling of not being really competent, because we are not good anywhere, not at work and not at home, not with our children, we are not good mothers. So this feeling of guilt, and when a woman, I think, is in charge, we can much more deeply relate to it and make space for others, to express the guilt, to be open about it, to lower it, to just have the conversation about it, which often doesn't happen in a men's world.
Let me quickly interject something and then turn to Julia for one dimension of this same question. The irony, of course, is, Sofia, is that when you look at the kind of the recent generation of leadership models and approaches, this emphasis on vulnerability, on humility, on the leader as learner, right? And on psychological safety and on feminist leadership, is actually bringing in a number of those things that you mentioned as the very strengths and the essence of those models. So turning to you, Julia, to what extent do you feel that you, as a woman leader, still cannot bring your whole person to leadership and need to adjust to some white male normed expectations of leadership? Or is that no longer an issue? Is this really past us?
No, definitely not past us. I think what I do feel is that I'm getting older, so I'm more confident that I don't have to, to get into that. But I do definitely feel that I have to push back on that. And everything, Sofia, you were just saying so resonates with me. As a new leader in an organization, so coming from the outside, as Gabriela has done as well, and during COVID, with the limitations of not being able to be in the same room with people, when we have a massive change agenda on our table, we have lots to deal with, lots of change needs to happen. So my approach, and this is my leadership approach, but I am sure it is my approach in part because I am a woman and I think that way and I react that way and I respond that way, is very much to listen and to learn and to see how I can facilitate some level of consensus to move things forward. And I am increasingly hearing very loud calls of just tell us what you think. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's going to work. It's not about what I think. Of course, I have lots of opinions. I'm going to, of course, try to influence people in conversations and put my ideas forward, but I'm not going to step in and, in what I think would be an incredibly arrogant way, say, I haven't known you guys for the last 20 years. Many of you have been here for the last 20 years, but I'm going to tell you what we need to do. I just couldn't do that. And I do, I really do believe, accounting for the non-binary comment that both Gabriela and Sofia have made, we are different. Women are different. And, part of the challenge is that when we are in leadership positions, how do we own that we are going to lead differently because we're different, right? And we are walking into a world that has been mostly occupied by men, leading like men, and that we're going to lead differently. And then how do we help our colleagues, come with us on that journey, because there's good side to that. And there might be some downsides, but there's definitely a lot of upsides, right? And we can see that. I mean, we can see that with what's happening with COVID and, the women leaders and how they're responding in their countries, countries led by women. I mean, that is not a fluke. I am absolutely convinced that there is a lot of foundation to that. We think differently. Our priorities are different. The things that motivate us are different. The priority, the issues that we're concerned with are different. And so, of course, our leadership will be different if we allow it to be, right? And that's at a personal level, we need to give ourselves permission. And even though there will be that self-doubt sometimes, I've been going, oh my God, am I too slow, coming out and telling them what I think? Do I have to be more forceful now, more propositional? Sure, probably, but it's not about, I still need to push back and say, no, that's not how I think I need to lead. I think I do need to listen and learn and then try to facilitate consensus to move us forward, and not just walk in with my big idea and just put it on the table and expect everybody to come along because I'm the leader, right?
Yeah.
Very different.
Gosh, I feel like we've only barely started to talk about things that we could go so much deeper in, and we can't because we've almost run out of time already. So let me ask you a near to final question, and that's a very open-ended question, and that is the following. And I will start with Gabriela this time. A question that is emerging for me at the end of our conversation is ... So Gabriela, for you, a question that is emerging for you at the end of our conversation is what?
So I have been wanting to say something around give permission, and what Julia would say starts with giving myself permission. So I very much believe it starts with me. But I liked Sofia's tweet yesterday about I had seen you with the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She is also giving us all permission. So is that double role? So I need to give myself permission and then be vocal about how I'm giving others permission to be different. It's opening and saying also not responding to certain demands. So that's my question. How much more to do that, and with whom?
So how to give not only yourself permission, but also to be vocal about giving all the forms of diversity of leadership behaviors permission. Good. How about you, Sofia? How would you answer that question?
After this conversation, it's always so wonderful to talk with Julia and Gabriela, because I think the question that always comes up, how can we much more purposefully do it together, And I think we are kind of in the same battles often, but how can we do much more hand holding than we do, to really stretch our imagination. So, while we frequently talk and have solidarity, I think we can even make a more conscious and deliberate effort.
So how to lead together, you're saying. Yes, really interesting. Julia, how would you answer that question?
I think I build on that. The question I have at the back of my head whenever we talk is, what's going to come out of this? Is there something potentially really big, different, significant for our sector that can come out of this informal, happy coincidence, bizarre happy coincidence that the three of us, happen to be able to speak in Spanish, and that's, the language we spoke at home and with our parents. And so there's that level of comfort and immediate familiarity, and that we're heading these three federations at the same time during this crazy time in the world with all these, this moment of reckoning for our sector, not just because of Black Lives Matter, but definitely, decolonizing aid, but, NGOs are, rightfully so, under the loop and being questioned from all kinds of. So what's the opportunity for the three of us to lead, to do something together, as Sofia was saying, intentionally, and to really change the landscape, because we're women, because we're Latin American women, because we're in these positions at the same time. I'm curious. I think there's actually something really amazing that could happen there, but it has to be intentional at some point. Yeah.
I also think it's already happening, because it's intentional, but also by being and by having these conversations that today we're having with Tosca and in the presence of others, but the others that we're having, they're also having an impact on each of us and the organizations we're in dialogue with. So
I definitely would encourage you to do that, and I would be the first to applaud that. So may this be another kind of stimulus to come to that point. So closing off, if our audience wants to learn more about each of you, where should they go as individual leaders? Gabriela?
Maybe the easiest is on LinkedIn. So I'm there and I'm in connection with lots of people. So that would be a good place to interact.
Okay, we will put that in the show notes. Sofia?
Yeah, same. LinkedIn, Twitter, those are the best ways. Easy to find. Just put in my name and I'll always happy to connect.
We'll put that in the show notes. Julia, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely. LinkedIn, Twitter for sure. And I'm sure there's some bios on each one of our websites that are not buried too far down, since we're recently appointed, sort of. So
I would think, Julia, even if you were not recently appointed, that should still be very findable on your website. Well, thank you, Julia, Sofia, Gabriela, for all your insights about leadership in general and about women and leadership. Thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast stimulating, please be sure to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And I'm going to keep this really brief by saying this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGO Soul and Strategy next time.